Welcome back to Bible study. This is the fifth lesson in our series on forgiveness, which is also a character study on Joseph, as we've been sharing. And we love for you to help us spread the word. So however you're watching or listening, please encourage others to get on. We're live now if you're watching at 12 or 6:30 on Wednesday. We're live now on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on YouTube, SMZBC Worships, and we're on Dialpad. So help us get the word out. As a brief overview, we began our study in week 1 looking at the background family history of Joseph. In week 2, we continued our exploration of the family drama, which began with Joseph in his parents' home and ends with him in the pit before being sold into captivity by his brothers. Week 3, we discussed how Joseph went from Potiphar's house to prison, where with God's help, Joseph was able to interpret dreams of a couple of the fellow prisoners. And most of you know the story, you're familiar with that part of it. Week 4, Reverend Butler last week talked about the in-between time, how Joseph spent 2 years in prison waiting to be remembered. And we ended up in Genesis 41 with Joseph being a 30-year-old man with a criminal record who was elevated from prison to a position of power in Pharaoh's palace. We ended with things starting to turn around for Joseph. Now, this is a good place for me to jump in and tell you that there is still work going on across the street, literally right to my right outside this window across the street, which is probably 20 feet, if not that. There's a huge 3-story, 67 apartment complex being built. So you're probably going to hear some stuff in the background. One of the workers told us today that they're almost done on the outside, thank God, so that we can have a noise-free Bible study. All right. So for today, we're going to continue this story while starting in the 42nd chapter of Genesis. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, so you'll hear a few verses and then I'll chime in after them.
When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons,
"Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die."
Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also.
Joseph knew that the famine spread far and wide, and in his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, God said that it would. God also had given him wisdom on how to prepare for the famine by storing up food during the harvest. One commentator observes that while Joseph was busy putting his nationwide disaster intervention plan into action, his family was beginning to feel the pinch of the famine in their own bellies. Jacob was hungry, and I can hear a bit of sarcasm in his voice when he asked his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" In other words, Jacob was saying, y'all just sitting around here looking hungry. That's not going to put any food on the table. So Jacob sends 10 of his 11 sons from Canaan to Egypt. Interestingly, the text notes that he didn't send Benjamin because he was scared that he'd be hurt in some way. Remember, Joseph and Benjamin shared the same mother. Rachel, the wife that Jacob wanted, the wife that Jacob loved, had died giving birth to Benjamin. Now here again, it appears that Jacob is preferring one son over the others. I think about if the older brothers knew why Benjamin didn't travel with them, and if they knew, how did it make them feel? Let's jump back into the text.
Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them.
Where do you come from?
He asked.
From the land of Canaan.
They replied.
To buy food.
Joseph might have already been selling grain to others from his homeland of Canaan. And I wonder if he was anticipating the arrival of his brothers, whether he thought about it, or if he was so caught up in his work that they had drifted to the back corner of his mind. In either case, the issue of forgiveness is now up front and personal. Can you relate to Joseph's predicament now? You're just out there doing what you have to, and out of nowhere, you see somebody who has hurt you. Or you see something that allows the pain from your past to resurface. If so, what were some of the emotions you experienced? Did you react? Did you respond? What did you do to avoid the situation? The biblical writers note that even as his brothers bowed before him, Joseph's response was to speak harshly to them, demanding that they tell him what they were there for. Can you sense the tension in the air? Let's keep going to see how Joseph handled this unexpected encounter with the people who caused him pain. Specifically, I want you to listen for Joseph's posture and tone here so that we can compare it to his response later in the text after he had some time to pray and think things over. Let's keep on listening.
Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them,
You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected.
No, my lord.
They answered.
Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies.
No!
He said to them.
You have come to see where our land is unprotected.
But they replied,
Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more.
Joseph said to them,
It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies.
First, let me give you a possible time frame. In chapter 645, Joseph lets us know that his brothers show up 2 years into the famine. We know from chapter 41 that the preceding harvest, which started when Joseph was about 30 years old, lasted for 7 years. So Joseph, whom his brothers haven't seen since throwing him in the pit when he was 17 years old, is now 39. He's a 39-year-old man handling his business in Egypt. Because he is speaking the language of the Egyptians, dressing like an Egyptian, in a position of authority in Egypt, his brothers don't have a clue as to who he is. They have no idea that the man with whom they are speaking is the brother they thought about killing and instead sold into slavery. While we can't get into Joseph's head, let's think through his behavior in the text. I think that his response is not super sanctified, and I'm glad about that because it makes his story more relatable. Scholars have many opinions about why Joseph reacted this way, including, first, number one, some suggest that he might have been acting the part of a strong Egyptian leader who had concerns that others were watching him. Second, another take is that perhaps Joseph had planned all along to react this way in an attempt to keep his brothers in town by calling them spies. Number three, another possibility is that he was caught off guard and made something up on the spot to buy him some more time to figure out his next step. Number four, still another idea is that Joseph's intent was to bait his brothers into bringing Benjamin and his father back to him. We don't know why Joseph responded this way, but what about you? What is your go-to response when you are in the presence of someone who has deeply hurt you? Joseph responded in a way that many of us may want to, but are not in the position of authority to do so.
And he put them all in custody for 3 days.
So was Joseph getting even with his brothers? That may be one way to look at it, but Bible commentators have suggested that we consider Joseph's character before we conclude that. Melissa Spolstra says that, quote, even this initial reaction could have been a plan for ultimate reconciliation rather than immediate retribution. Not knowing exactly what was going on inside his heart and his mind, I do see a valuable lesson here for us that I call the rule of response, unquote. The rule of response involves waiting so that painful emotions can get shaken out like a dirty rug. When something gets stirred inside of us that evokes either new or old feelings of pain, we would do well to take a pause before making any decisions that we might regret. How many times has something or somebody made you mad and you had your finger on the keyboard or at work or your phone wanting to react rather than respond? Have you ever posted a passive-aggressive social media message that you know is aimed at only a few people? Or sent an email with harsh choice words to a coworker? Or been offended because we received a text that we aren't sure how to take since it didn't include a smiley face emoji? Rather than reacting immediately, we should take time to listen, reflect, pray, and ask God for wisdom. Joseph took 3 days for his rule of response. And I know in our fast-paced world, you might not have 3 full days to respond, but at least try the 24-hour rule. Whatever it is that you want to react to, big or small, wait first. Think, pray, ask God for wisdom. Allow for your emotions to settle just a bit so that you can see things more clearly. It's taken me a while to mature to that point, and sometimes I still fail at it. But I've learned that this rule works. If you take some time, think on what you're going to do before you do it, it usually leaves you in a better place. Let's keep on listening to what happened on the third day.
On the third day, Joseph said to them,
Do this, and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and that you may not die.
This they proceeded to do.
Do you notice the change in Joseph's tone? Here we find Joseph much more in control of his emotions with a confident plan. People can deeply hurt you with the things that they say and their actions. However, it's amazing what a little bit of time and prayer can do to change your perspective and help you deal with people in a manner that pleases God. And again, I know it's not easy. The work of forgiveness is hard, but it is not impossible, especially when you realize that the people who hurt you were well aware that they hurt you. All right, let's keep on listening.
They said to one another,
Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us.
Reuben replied,
Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood.
They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep.
We find a detail here that wasn't expressly stated earlier in the story. Joseph was terrified and pleading in that hole over a decade ago as a teenage boy. Hearing his brothers talk of it might have taken him right back to a place even now as a husband and father in his 30s. It seemed to reopen an old wound. He named his first child Manasseh, meaning that now he could forget. But in this moment, the old pain became fresh all over again, and he couldn't contain his feelings. Have you ever had a time when an old wound resurfaced and you were overcome with emotion? Think about the roller coaster of emotions that Joseph was experiencing. His brothers were acknowledging that they heard him pleading for his life, but they refused to listen. Joseph's brothers could not have fully understood his pain, the separation from his father and the prison sentence that he had endured as a result of their betrayal. Now he had been exalted and his dreams were coming full circle. His brothers bowed before him and he held their future in his hands. Joseph heard his brothers speak of what they did to him only in terms of God punishing them for it. We don't hear great remorse over what he might have endured after selling him to the Midianites. Instead, they were concerned that their bad deeds had finally caught up to them, and finally, they would face consequences for their actions. Joseph needed time to sort through his perception of what his brother said, what had happened as a result, and what God intended to do through it all. So Joseph did what he had done before. He took a break in order to gather himself before responding. Now, I often say that your perception is your reality, but also know that your perception and the truth don't always line up. How we perceive a look or a comment or an action isn't always the originator's intent. And with social media, we can post and reply instantly to what someone has said based on our perception of what they meant. Without hearing someone's tone in a face-to-face encounter, we can do much damage that we can't take back by hitting send or posting something too quickly. But we need to consider this very true statement. We tend to judge others by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. That's something that I want you guys to think about. We tend to judge others by their actions, but you judge yourself by your intentions. When we find ourselves confronting someone who has hurt us, or when we interact with people with whom we have very complicated relationships, just like Joseph, we need to take some time to sort through our feelings and sort through our thoughts. If you're currently in a situation where you're trying to figure out the motives of someone else, take a moment to ask God to help you sort through your perception and reality. Reflect on any insights that God gives you into determining fact from fiction in your mental gymnastics about a person or a situation. Then ask God to give you a glimpse into the greater purpose in this relationship. Is God using it to grow the fruit of the Spirit in your life? Does God want to use you as an example of mercy and grace toward them? Does God know that you just need to have a good cry like Joseph about some painful memories or current difficulties? All right, we're headed toward the finish line. Let's continue the story.
He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack.
My silver has been returned,
He said to his brothers.
Here it is in my sack.
Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other, trembling, and said,
What is this that God has done to us?
Joseph came back after he got himself together and carried out his next steps. He had Simeon tied up to put a little fear into his brothers and motivate them to take this situation seriously. Why Simeon? While we can't be certain, we know that at one point in his life, Simeon was a brutal man. If you remember when we discussed Joseph's family history, it was Simeon that led the way in the murders of all the men of Shechem when his sister Dinah was raped. Maybe it had been Simeon's cruelty that Joseph re-envisioned when he remembered being at the bottom of a pit crying out for help. Maybe God had specifically told Joseph to pick Simeon. No matter the reason, Joseph detained Simeon. And I know his plan seems cruel at face value, but ultimately, God used Joseph's actions to reunite his broken family. When we read this text, we may begin to question whether Joseph fully processed what had happened to him. Had he forgiven his brothers during his prison years? If he did, why didn't he simply reveal himself and embrace his brothers at first sight? I think it's complicated, and it requires that we explore the concept of testing and rebuilding trust before beginning the reconciliation process. In order to see God's bigger plan and give time for emotions to settle, we must learn to wait before taking action. so that we can be responders instead of reactors. Think about it. Are you more of a quick-tempered reactor or more thoughtful responder? You may find that you react to certain people and respond to others. Also, the time of day, the amount of sleep that you've had, the events leading up to an encounter, and the amount of time that you have spent in the Word and in prayer can influence your ability to respond. Joseph recognized his brothers in Genesis 42, but he didn't immediately reveal himself, nor did he embrace them. He needed first to determine whether it would be safe to rebuild trust after 2 decades of change. Joseph exercised caution and tested them in order to see if it would be safe to let his guard down and reveal his true identity. Sometimes God will lead you to do just that. Let's listen to what happened when Jacob's sons returned home.
When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said,
"The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We are not spies. We were 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan.'"
Then the man who was Lord over the land said to us, "This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land."
as they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them,
You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.
Then Reuben said to his father,
"You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back."
But Jacob said,
My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, he will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow.
It's interesting that Jacob's sons claimed to be honest men, but they didn't recount to their father the part about believing these events were actually retribution for what they did to Joseph many years earlier. Their view of God seems to be punitive. They tied their past deeds to current misfortune. One scholar says of Joseph's brothers, they are bound by the power of an unforgiving past, immobilized by guilt and driven by anxiety. If you are the one who has wronged someone and you are struggling with feelings that everything that is happening to you now is a result of a bad decision you made in the past, even though you've asked God to forgive you, try listening to sermons about God's love. Put on some upbeat gospel music. Join us for Bible study. Google and then memorize scriptures about God's love so that you can develop a healthy biblical picture of God. Our God is merciful. Our God is loving. Our God is forgiving. Psalm 103:8 says, "The Lord is compassionate and merciful, slow to anger, and filled with unfailing love." I also want you to go back, if you're watching this, when this is over, and that spoke to you, that last 30 seconds, I want you to go back and I want you to watch it again and let that part continue to speak to you. For his part, Joseph seems to have trusted this God of mercy in his own life, but he must have thought it was wise to test his brothers before fully trusting them. Joseph needed to determine his brother's character. He hadn't seen them in so long, and he had changed much over the course of time while working in Potiphar's house, enduring prison, and serving as a royal official under Pharaoh. Now we needed to see what his brothers were like. When he was 17, he didn't realize how unsafe they were until he was pleading with them from the bottom of a pit. He wouldn't make the same mistake again, so he set up opportunities to test them. and evaluate whether he could reconcile. Just as silver was put in a fire to see if it were real, Joseph put his brothers in the fire to see if their character had changed. Joseph had been tested through the fire of adversity to reveal the quality of his own character. He needed to do the same with his brothers to see how they would handle being unjustly detained and to ascertain if they would display integrity and loyalty toward Benjamin. This would be key information in knowing whether he could trust them with his true identity. Under pressure, our true nature is exposed. When conflict or difficulty puts our relationships to the test, we have to seek God's help. Joseph wanted to see his father and his younger brother Benjamin, yes, but he also wanted to determine if his brothers are safe. Can they establish a relationship of some sort? Could he introduce them to his wife and children? Joseph put them to the test. While he tested his brothers, it appears that he saw God's wisdom for each step of discovery. Throughout Joseph's story, we see his focus and his faith in the God of his father, Jacob. And here's the thing, y'all. Sometimes we can be too quick to reconnect after experiencing pain in a relationship. If we reestablish trust without testing for safety first, we can end up losing a relationship for lack of proper boundaries. If you don't remember anything else from today, remember this. Although we can always forgive, we may not always reconcile. Reconciliation takes two willing, humble partners. So if you're watching this at 12 or 6:30 on Wednesday, I look forward to you coming over to Dialpad in a few minutes after I conclude this. This week, I want to hear how you will answer this question. How do you feel about Joseph testing his brothers before revealing himself to them? And then the second question, when someone has wronged you, do you test before you trust again? First, how do you feel about Joseph testing his brothers before revealing himself? And then second, when someone has wronged you, do you test before you trust again? All right, that's it for this Wednesday. Again, this is the 5th week. If you're watching on Wednesday at 12 or 6:30, I want you to go ahead, prepare to transition on over to Dialpad. You can do it online, meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC, or you can call 804-203-9011. Meetings.dialpad.com/SMZBC, or 804-203-9011. We got 2 discussion questions today. Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, we'll be on for prayer at this same mechanism on Dialpad. Friday, we'll be serving or operating our food pantry from 12 to 1. If you know anybody that needs groceries, we'll be here. And then Sunday, we'll be worshiping in person and online. And remember, on the 3rd Sunday this month, we'll celebrate our Founders Day. Our guest preacher, Dr. Patricia Gould Champ, will be with us, one of our former Jasper Day recipients. And so that is the 3rd Sunday. All right, come on, jump on over for After Bible Study.